Everyone, welcome back to American History 1 Final Exam Review. Today we're going to be reviewing Unit 3, which covers the early history of the United States all the way up to the War of 1812. So we'll start off talking about stuff that happened right before the new Constitution was made and George Washington became president, all the way up to when we fight Great Britain again. Sometimes people call it the Second War of Independence, but we'll get to that in just a little while. So, like usual with the other screencast, you need to go ahead now and get out a piece of your own notebook paper. There are no guided notes with the review, and then take the notes to use on the Unit 3 review quiz. So, the first key term we're going to talk about is the Federalist Papers. So, remember, at the end of the Unit 2 screencast, we ended talking about how the Articles of Confederation was really weak and how with Shays' Rebellion and stuff like that, people started to realize that the federal government needed to be stronger. So what happens is that there's going to be a constitutional convention, and there's going to be a lot of really important people. You know, the founding fathers are all going to meet, and they're going to talk about what they're going to do. And they were supposed to only talk about changing the Articles of Confederation, but eventually they're going to decide that they need to be got rid of completely, and they're going to create a new constitution. Uh, and so they kind of go against their orders in creating the new constitution. But when they come out with the new constitution, there's going to be a lot of stuff in there, and all it really boils down to is that the federal government is going to be strengthened. It's going to be a lot stronger and have more power than the Articles of Confederation did. There's now going to be three branches of government instead of just one. There's going to be a president, like a chief executive, that can make really important decisions, has more power than some people would like. And because people had more power than some people liked, and it was a new idea, then what you're going to see is a lot of skepticism to the new Constitution. So the Federalist Papers are going to be written in order for people to understand what's in the new Constitution and try to get their support of the new Constitution, because enough states had to ratify the Constitution for it to go into effect. And if enough states didn't ratify the Constitution, then it wouldn't go into effect. So the Federalist Papers are going to argue that yes, the government does have more power now, but it's a good thing. They're going to argue that there's going to be checks and balances. So one branch of government is not going to have, more power than the other, and that in the end, even though the federal government has more power, it's a good thing for the nation. So, in the new Constitution, there's going to be a lot of principles in the Constitution that you've already learned about if you've taken civics, but as sort of a review of that, one of the most important principles in the new Constitution is going to be federalism. And so that means just simply there's going to be two types of government. You're going to have a state government and you're going to have a federal or a national government. And within each type of government, the state and the federal government, they're going to have certain powers that the others don't. And then there's also going to be some overlap between the two. So, in the Articles of Confederation, really the state government had more power. The federal government was more or less a figurehead, and under the new Constitution and under federalism, uh, what you're going to see is the federal government have more power. You can see over here in the Venn diagram all of the things that the federal government now has power to do that they didn't have under the Articles of Confederation. But the people that framed and made up the new Constitution did not want to have a dictatorship where the federal government had all the power. So under federalism, the state government still had power. They can have local government, which is like your county government, your local sheriff's office. In Iredell County, I'm sure you know the sheriff's office and all of that. In the the county seat of Statesville, and that's an example of a local government that they have the power to make because of federalism. And in the end, there's going to be tension between this federal government and the state governments, and eventually that'll lead to the Civil War. The state governments in the South are going to want to have more power, than they have in the Constitution. They're going to try to overstep the federal government, and eventually that's going to cause the Civil War later on. So, in the new nation, after the Constitution has already been made, we're going to have a lot of economic problems. Our nation was pretty weak. It didn't have a lot of money because we just fought the American Revolution, and that's really expensive to do, especially when you're fighting against a country as powerful as Britain. So, in order to raise money for the federal government, one strategy that people are going to come up with is a tariff. And so, what a tariff is, uh, you know, its formal definition is a tax on imported goods. Now, that's just a really, more complicated way of saying that anytime a product that's made in a foreign country is shipped into the United States, we're going to charge money for that to be made or for that to be sold in the United States. So, in this picture here, if this, a towel is made in Britain, whenever it gets to a port along the United States, then they're going to add $1 to the price of that towel. And so, if the towels that are made in America only cost $4 and this British towel now costs $5, then which one are people going to buy? Well, they're going to buy the American made towel. And so that's going to help American businesses. That's going to help the government because some people are still going to buy the British made towels. And when they do, that $1 goes to the federal government. So they're going to get money out of this as well. Ultimately, it does raise money for the federal government, but it's going to be hated by the southern states. And it's going to be hated by the southern states because they are largely based on agriculture. And whenever you have your agricultural products like your tobacco from Jamestown and eventually cotton, you're going to want to sell that overseas. And when you're trying to sell it to, say, Britain, well, they know that they're already losing money on the towels that are being made in Britain. So they're going to charge the South a tariff and they're going to have to pay more taxes that way. And so the South will be hurt because they're going to lose money from it, and eventually that will uh, help cause the Civil War because the northern businesses liked the tariff, but the South did not. So the tariff was a smaller part of Hamilton's financial plan. Alexander Hamilton, he was a founding father. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury, and the Secretary of the Treasury is responsible for managing the money and the money supply of the nation and the economy. And so, what Alexander Hamilton is going to do is come up with a financial plan and he is going to present this plan to the president at this time, George Washington, and it's going to be implemented. And this plan was to help the economy of the United States because, like we just talked about, the country was really poor, really weak after the American Revolution. Well, Hamilton's plan is going to create a Bank of the United States, which is this building right here. The Bank of the United States is going to be responsible for managing the money supply of the nation, the currency, creating a federal currency. People can buy stock in the Bank of the United States, and eventually, the South is not going to like that because they think that the Bank of the United States is going to have too much power. But the North is going to like it because they're going to buy the stock in the bank. The second part of his plan was the state debts that are incurred is going to be covered by the federal government. So the federal government will now have a national debt that will have to be paid off. And then they're also going to have excise taxes. And so, what an excise tax is a tax on a product that is made within the United States. So we'll get to the Whiskey Rebellion later on, but what they're going to do is put a tax on whiskey, and a lot of people are not going to like that. But Hamilton knew that the federal government had to get some money flowing into it if it was going to be around for very long. So Alexander Hamilton was the leader of the Federalist Party. And so, whenever he came up with his financial plan, it was mainly backed by the Federalist Party. And so, what the Federalist Party wanted is a strong federal government. You can remember that by their name. Federalist Party wanted a strong federal government. And he supported, obviously, the Bank of the United States. He came up with the Bank of the United States. And so he's going to support his bank, and then his followers are going to support the bank. Um, they're going to want, they're obviously going to be in favor of the Constitution. They're going to want a stronger federal government. They're going to want the president to have as much power as possible. Alexander Hamilton, actually, whenever the Constitution was being debated, he proposed having a president that could serve for life. Ultimately, that got kind of voted down because people thought it was too similar to the king, which was just defeated during the American Revolution. But ultimately, the Federalist Party is not going to be the most important party. In fact, John Adams, which we'll get to later, he was the only Federalist president. George Washington was an independent, and John Adams, the second president, was the only Federalist president. So the opposing political party to the Federalist Party is the Democratic Republican Party. And it's going to be led by this guy here, Thomas Jefferson, the future third president of the United States. And the Democratic Republican Party is not like the Democratic or the Republican Party today, just to clear that up. It's completely different. What the Democratic Republican Party wanted was a stronger state government and a weaker federal government. Thomas Jefferson and his followers would argue that because each state has different needs, then the state should be able to come up with its own laws and its own set of rules because of that. He would say the state of New York has different needs than the state of Virginia or North Carolina. And so, because of that, the state government should be free to make whatever decisions they needed. The Democratic Republican Party is going to oppose the Bank of the United States. They felt that giving the federal government too much power to regulate the national economy was not a good thing. It was a step back toward the monarchy that had just been defeated in the American Revolution. And one more thing to point out is that the Democratic Republican Party was primarily around and popular in the South, like where we live in North Carolina. A lot of the people in this area would have been Democratic Republicans. A lot of the people in the Western Frontier area would have been Democratic Republicans. And then the people north of us in the Northeast would have been Federalist. And I forgot to mention that on the last slide, but the geography, that's kind of where they lived. And so, when we talked about Hamilton's plan, we talked about an excise tax on whiskey. And so, there were some farmers out in western Pennsylvania. They made whiskey and sold whiskey. And whenever they had to pay that tax on whiskey that Alexander Hamilton came up with, um, they didn't like it because they're losing money on their whiskey. And so, they're going to rebel. And when President George Washington learns of this rebellion, he will form an army, a national army, and he will personally lead that army of thousands of troops to put down a rebellion of a few hundred whiskey brewers. And this is going to show that the federal government is powerful. It's more powerful than the Articles of Confederation, and it shows that the Constitution works, that the federal government is a legitimate government that can put down stuff like this. And you can really compare this to Shays' Rebellion. Under Shays' Rebellion, you had the Articles of Confederation, and Shays' Rebellion, which was similarly a group of poor farmers, it almost got out of hand and they almost overthrew the government. Well, that's not true with the Whiskey Rebellion. It was put down. It was put down very quickly and very easily by George Washington. So, speaking of George Washington, one of the most important principles that he followed while he was president was the idea of neutrality. And so, under neutrality, what he's going to say is that the United States, at this point in its early history, should not get involved in any wars or any affairs of other nations. And so, the reason why Washington argued and believed in this is because he knew that the United States at this point was a really weak nation, that if the United States was to get involved in a war in Europe with Britain or France or any nation in Europe, it would more than likely be defeated and the United States would not be around. And so, he would argue that we just fought the American Revolution, people were killed fighting for this country. We should try to make sure that we're not going to do anything that will jeopardize its future. And so, simply, he just wanted to make sure that the United States would not be involved in world affairs. And for the most part, he will follow this principle. The people that are going to come after him really are not, and we'll get into that later. Uh, but while George Washington is in office, there's going to be the issue of impressment. And so, what impressment is whenever there are British ships out in the Atlantic Ocean, they're going to take some Americans hostage and they're going to be forced to work on these British ships. And so, obviously, if you're taking Americans hostage, that's not a good thing. It's really a provocative action that could lead to war. But remember, George Washington believed in neutrality. He did not want to fight Britain a second time because he knew that it would just jeopardize the United States. He wasn't convinced that at this point the United States could defeat Britain a second time. So he's going to send a guy named John Jay over to Britain to negotiate a treaty with Britain. And he's going to try to keep the peace between the United States and Britain. And ultimately, what John Jay is going to do is accept a treaty that does not solve impressment at all. In fact, it allows for impressment to continue. Britain could continue taking Americans hostage. And because of this, people were really, really upset with John Jay, and they even got upset somewhat with George Washington. And you can see here they would burn and hang effigies of John Jay. People were that upset about it because they thought that he was going to allow Americans to be continue to be exploited, and they were kind of right because impressment was allowed to continue. So another treaty that's going to be important under George Washington, and this one will turn out a little bit better than Jay's treaty, is Pinckney's treaty. So what this treaty does is give the United States access to the Mississippi River and to New Orleans down here in Louisiana. And this was controlled by Spain at this point. And this is really important because a lot of the farmers here in the South, near where we live, in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then eventually down in this area, they're going to be growing stuff like tobacco. Eventually, they're going to grow cotton. Well, in order to make money off of that, you have to be able to sell that agricultural product overseas. And so the only way you can do that is if you live here in Tennessee, it would be much easier for you to get on the Cumberland River and then float down the Mississippi River and sell it in New Orleans, put it on a boat and send it out overseas to sell it instead of having to go across the Appalachian Mountains and try to get to the Atlantic Ocean through North Carolina. And to be honest, there are not many ports in North Carolina that you can sell stuff at. So, what this treaty did is gave access to the Mississippi River and to New Orleans. The southern farmers can put their products on the boats and sell them. They can make money off of them, which is a good thing. But keep in mind what's emphasized here is access to the Mississippi River and New Orleans. At this point, the United States does not own any of this land, they're just allowed to use it. And so eventually, whenever France gains this area of land, uh, this treaty will not apply because it's with Spain. And so that's going to have to be resolved later on, and it will be with the Louisiana Purchase. But we'll get to that later. Uh, so at the end of George Washington's presidency, he only serves 2 terms. He decides to retire after 2 years and not run for a third term. And so at the end of his second term, what he's going to do is write up a farewell address. Now, he didn't actually go out and give a speech, he just wrote it and it was published in newspapers. So What Washington is going to say is really going to give a warning to the country, and he's going to tell them to be fearful and try to prevent three things from happening. He didn't want people to get involved in foreign affairs, so he was promoting his idea of neutrality. He argued, like I mentioned earlier, that the United States is still a weak nation, and that if you get involved in a foreign affair, it's only going to bring the country down and maybe not even exist anymore. He also warned against political parties. And now, remember, George Washington was an independent president. He was not affiliated with any political party. And he thought that a political party would just divide the country, which ultimately they do. He was right in this. And he feared that if there was not national unity in the country because of political parties, then it would be uh, bad for the nation because you're going to be divided. People are going to continually to argue over, and it could lead to something bad, and eventually it will with the Civil War. And that's the third part of the farewell address: is sectionalism. And so, this, I believe, is the first time we've talked about sectionalism in the review PowerPoints. And remember, it's whenever you promote one region, your region of the country, over the interest of the country as a whole. So, if you live in the South, you're going to promote the Southern interest over the interest of the country as a whole. And so ultimately, that's not going to be a good thing. It'll lead to the Civil War because people are not going to want to compromise with a different region of the country if you're very attached to your region of the country and only want it to succeed and not the country as a whole. And so Washington realized that and he warned against it. So, speaking of sectionalism, I've already kind of got ahead of myself and I'm sorry for that. But sectionalism is whenever, like I said, you're going to be promoting one region of the country over the region or a different region of the country. And so this really is between the North and the South, not really the West. The North and the South is the most important because eventually that's going to cause the Civil War. And so an example of this would be the tariff issue. So, the North wanted that tariff because they knew that it would protect their businesses, that people would buy their American made products because the tariff raised prices on the British goods and any foreign good. So they wanted it. The South didn't want it because they were going to be charged a retaliatory tariff whenever they tried to sell products to Britain or other countries that are impacted by the tariff of the United States. And so eventually, both sides are not going to compromise over this, and it'll lead to the Civil War. Starting off early on, there will be some compromises that happen between the North and the South, and we'll get to those later. Eventually, though, it's not going to happen, and it'll lead to the Civil War. So, another thing that happened in the early history of the country is the XYZ affair. So, there's going to be some tension between the United States and France, and there's going to be eventually they call it a quasi war because it's a really an unofficial and undeclared war. And so what's going to happen is, in order to prevent it from happening and try to reduce the tensions between France and the United States, John Adams is now president. He's the second president. He's going to send over some delegates from the United States to meet with the French minister and even the president of France at that point. And what's going to happen is that when they get there, the French officials are going to tell them that you cannot meet with any of our French leaders until you pay us some money. And so this is really going to humiliate the United States. It'll make the United States look really weak, embarrassed, and eventually they're not going to be able to compromise. There's going to be some more unofficial fighting between the American and the French Navy. As far as I know, there was not any military fighting on land, but I think there definitely was with the Navy, and it's because France did not negotiate early on. Now, eventually they will, and there's not going to be an official war with France, but there will be sort of an undeclared war with France. And so, whenever we talk about the early history of the country, we should talk about we talked about sectionalism, and something that kind of goes along with that is the Virginia and the Kentucky Resolution. So we just talked about John Adams, and whenever he is president, he's going to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so what the Alien and Sedition Acts do overall, it does two things. It's going to limit the amount of immigrants that can come to the United States, and it's also going to make it illegal to criticize the federal government. And so these were laws that were passed by the Federalists. Well, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were promoted by people in the South. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wrote them. They were Democratic Republicans. They lived in the South, and the Alien and Sedition Acts was passed by John Adams. He lived in Massachusetts. So you can already see how this early sectionalism is happening in the nation. Um, and so, what the resolutions say is that these Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional, meaning that it violates the Constitution, and because they violate the Constitution, then an individual state can nullify those resolutions within the boundaries of that state. They can basically ignore the law if they don't agree with it. And, you'll see this later on. Some southern states would use this to get rid of a tariff they don't like, and eventually it's going to cause enough tension to lead to the Civil War because uh, the South fears that the federal government will come after slavery. The federal government never actually did before the Civil War happened, but if that were the case, they would argue that they could nullify or ignore that law from happening. And so, speaking of nullification, what nullification is, to kind of review, I know I got ahead of myself again, but it's the idea that an individual state could basically ignore a law that was passed by the federal government that they didn't like. So, one of the first terms we talked about was federalism, where the state and the federal government have powers, and there is some overlap between the two. Their powers are kind of separate, and the idea is that the federal government should have the final say over laws that are passed. Well, the idea of nullification kind of throws that on its head and says that if a state does not like a law that's been passed by the federal government, then we can just ignore it, we can override it, we can pretend like it doesn't exist. And eventually, this will lead to the Civil War because uh, the northern and the southern states are not going to agree on the types of laws that are going to be passed. And if one state can just simply say, well, I don't like that law, it doesn't apply to me, let's get rid of it, the federal government is going to try to enforce that law. It'll eventually get to the point where neither side will compromise, and that's how it leads to the Civil War. So, we talked about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson already. Well, they're going to run against each other for president in 1800. And so, in the election of 1796, John Adams will be elected president, and Thomas Jefferson ran against him in that election. So, this is kind of a rematch. And in this election, though, Thomas Jefferson is going to win, and largely he won because of the Alien and Sedition Acts we talked about, especially the Sedition Act. People thought that if you are not allowed to criticize the government, then you're putting yourself on a slippery slope toward a dictatorship. And to be honest, they were probably right. And so John Adams is going to be defeated. He was a Federalist. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. So, for the first time in our nation's history, there's going to be a transition of power between two different political parties because remember, George Washington was a Federalist, or excuse me, he was independent. So, for the first time, the political parties are going to swap who's in power. And in this election, it was a peaceful transfer of power. There was no fighting. There was no, well, there was, verbal fighting in the election, but there was no military action. John Adams didn't use the army to try to keep himself in power. Power was transferred. Thomas Jefferson became president, and that is really rare at this point because in a lot of countries, whenever there's going to be a new person in power, there's a lot of fighting. You can see a civil war even break out. And that didn't happen in this case. It showed that the Constitution worked, that the way we elect a president works. So this was really, really important. And it was called a revolution, like I said, because it was rare at this point in history. So, something that's going to happen early on in the history of our nation is Marbury versus Madison. So, the Supreme Court prior to this ruling it existed, but it really did not make any important decisions. They, at this point, were not deciding whether or not a law was constitutional or not. But Marbury versus Madison, and you don't really need to know the background behind this. There's going to be a fight over whether or not James Madison can become a cabinet secretary, and he's going to appeal it to the Supreme Court. And there's a lot more details about that you don't need to know. But in the end, what the Supreme Court is going to rule is that they have the power to review any type of law that has been passed by Congress and signed by the President to determine whether or not that law is constitutional. And so, what they do is that they're going to look at the Constitution and they're going to see whether or not a law fits within the parameters of the Constitution. And if a law is not following the Constitution, then they can declare it unconstitutional, and that law will not be in effect anymore. And so, and this is a really good analogy of it here in the football game. You can see they're like a referee; they can decide whether or not something that one team did is allowable or not. And so, that's a good cartoon to help you visualize the way that happens. So, whenever Thomas Jefferson becomes president, he's going to become president, like we said, in 1800. Something that's going to happen is that the area of land that we talked about earlier, it's now going to be controlled by France, and so the Pinckney's Treaty is not going to apply to this area of land anymore. And so, but the Southern farmers are still going to want to be able to trade on the Mississippi River. And so, what Thomas Jefferson is going to do is send over some diplomats to France and negotiate with Napoleon, who was now the leader of France, to try to get back the Mississippi River and to continue farming. He just wanted a little bit of land down here. But what's going to happen is that Napoleon, and you don't really need to know the world history behind it, but France is going through some problems, and he doesn't want to have to look after all of this land and what would become the United States. And so what he's going to do is sell this land to the United States. He's going to sell it for a really, really cheap price. It's like 3 cents an acre, which is really, really cheap. And Thomas Jefferson, he's a Democratic Republican. He believed that you should not do anything if the Constitution does not explicitly say you can do it. Well, it doesn't explicitly say that the president can double the size of the country through a treaty and buy land. But he is going to do that because he felt like it was too good of a deal to pass up. So he sort of compromises his beliefs a little bit in order to make this happen. But it's going to be important because, like under Pinckney's Treaty, they just had access to the Mississippi River in New Orleans. Well, now you own it, and you can do whatever you want to with it. And so, whenever that big area of land was bought, it was owned by France, but it's really wilderness. People don't really know what's happening out there, what the wildlife is like there, what kind of or what the geography of the region is. And so, what Thomas Jefferson is going to do is authorize some people, there are officers in the army, um, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They're going to start out here in St. Louis, and they're going to go up the Missouri River, and they're just going to explore this land. They're going to try and see if there are any Native American tribes out here. There were some out there. They established contact with the Native American tribes. They collected some wildlife samples. They saw there's a really famous example in a primary source activity you did earlier in the class where they saw a grizzly for the first time. So they're just trying to see what life is like in this area of the country. And they're also going to see if there's a water route to the Pacific Ocean. If you remember, something that the explorers all the way back in the early, like, or the late 1400s, what they're trying to do is get a water route where they can sail pretty much across this nation and get to Asia without having to go all the way around Africa. Ultimately, there's not going to be a water route to the Pacific Ocean, but that was sort of a goal that they had, and obviously they weren't able to meet it because it doesn't exist. Um, Another thing that's going to happen to Thomas Jefferson whenever he's president is the Chesapeake Affair. So the Chesapeake Affair is another example of what happens whenever impressment is still continuing. Remember that under Jay's Treaty, impressment was still allowed, and Britain was still continuing to take the American soldiers hostage. And so, what's going to happen is that the American soldiers are going to be attacked uh, on this boat. The Chesapeake Affair is the name of the boat. The Chesapeake is the name of the boat, and they're going to be attacked. There's going to be some that are killed, and this is really going to raise tension with Britain because, uh, you're now killing American soldiers. On these boats are not doing anything wrong, so you're killing them, you're taking them hostage. So you can see how this is really going to raise tension. At this point, there could have been a war, and probably a justifiable war, with Britain, but there's not going to be a war with Britain because people are at this point remembering what George Washington said, that we should be neutral, that we should not fight in other wars, that we should try to keep to ourselves. And that's why they're going to postpone this war with Britain. Eventually, there is going to be a war with Britain, the War of 1812, but not at this point. So, another thing that's going to happen to Thomas Jefferson when he's president is that he's going to pass what's called the Embargo Act. And so, the Embargo Act says that there's going to be absolutely no trade with Europe at all, with any nation in Europe. And so, the purpose for this law is that if there are no American sailors out on the Atlantic Ocean trading with Britain, then how are these soldiers going to be taken hostage? If there are none out there, then the impressment cannot continue. Well, that's a good idea, and it did stop impressment, but ultimately you're going to have to trade if you want to have a good economy. And whenever the Embargo Act is passed, these businesses, especially in the North, are not going to be able to sell any of their products to any foreign nation, and that's going to hurt their revenue, and it's going to hurt the economy overall. We actually have a recession because of the Embargo Act. And this really made Thomas Jefferson unpopular. It hurt him, especially in the North, because their businesses needed to trade. The Southern, farmers, they needed to trade too. And whenever no one can trade, it's going to hurt um, the economy. And this cartoon kind of, portrays that pretty well. This guy here is trying to trade something, and the Embargo Act is this turtle here holding him back from doing it, and he, obviously is not very happy with it. So, something else that's going to happen in the early history of the United States, that there's going to be a lot of battles with Native Americans. And so Tecumseh is a Native American uh, that's going to be popular. He's going to be a Native American leader. And so, after the Revolutionary War ended, there's going to be a lot of Native Americans that have been pushed to the west, and they're in this region of the nation here. And Britain is still going to occupy some of these forts out here in the western part of the nation. And when the Native Americans are also in the western part of the nation, they're going to form a alliance. And what's going to happen is this Native American leader Tecumseh is going to use weapons that were obtained by Britain to go and attack people here in the western part of the country. There's a Greenville Treaty line where the Americans were supposed to be able to live without any kind of pushback from Native Americans. Well, the United States is going to violate that treaty, and Tecumseh is going to fight back with the British weapons. And ultimately, that's not going to be a good thing because whenever the Americans have been attacked by these Native Americans, they're not going to like it. Eventually, Tecumseh will be defeated, but it also shows that Britain is still trying to hurt the United States after they've already been defeated. And so this is raising the tension even more with Britain. Eventually, it'll help cause the War of 1812. So, getting to the War of 1812, there's the main causes of the War of 1812, which you need to know, is the election of war hawks, the conflict with the Native Americans, and impressment. And kind of along with that is the economic issues with the nation. And so, this war is going to be fought with Britain. Now, remember after the Chesapeake affair, I said how the United States is really going to try and prevent it from happening. They're still trying to be neutral in world affairs. That's not going to happen anymore. Impressment is still going to continue, like with Tecumseh, we just talked about. There's conflict with the Native Americans when they see that the Native Americans are being aided by Britain. That's only going to push the matter even more. And then the election of Warhawk. So in the election of 1810, is a midterm election where the people in Congress are up for re-election and a few senators are up for re-election. And these people, they're predominantly from the West, so they're dealing with these Native American attacks often. They're going to be really vocal in wanting war with Britain, and eventually they're going to get it. America will declare war on Britain, and the War of 1812 will be fought. The White House is going to be burned uh, while James Madison is president. This war is not really popular with the northern part of the country. They're going to blame James Madison for the war. Sometimes you'll hear it called Mr. Madison's War, blaming him for the war. But ultimately, all of these issues combined is what will cause the War of 1812. There's really not one issue in particular that causes it. There's many issues that cause it. All of them together will kind of push it over the edge. So the Battle of New Orleans is really the last battle of the War of 1812. And what's ironic about the Battle of New Orleans is that the war was technically already over by the time this battle was fought. Um, but what you're going to see at the Battle of and the reason why they had not got word of it is because, the technology that we have today didn't exist. And so they'd signed a peace treaty ending the war, but they had no idea the peace treaty existed. So the American troops, led by Andrew Jackson, and then the British troops are still going to fight in New Orleans, even though the war is over. And the Battle of New Orleans was won by the United States. But without getting into the details of the battle, the reason why it's so important is because it's going to create a lot of nationalism in the United States. And so, nationalism is really a extreme form of patriotism. And so, the reason why it created nationalism is because not only did the United States get to keep its independence after the War of 1812, the War of 1812 really ended in a draw. There was really no clear winner, but the United States kind of stayed around and drug the war out enough to where they didn't lose any land. And so, if you combine that with winning the Battle of New Orleans, um, that's going to make people feel very patriotic about their nation, and eventually you're going to get into the era of good feelings because of this battle. A second part, or a second effect of the Battle of New Orleans is that it's going to make Andrew Jackson a war hero. So, what you'll find throughout history, even when you take American history too, is that it's really, really easy to elect a war hero president because they're seen as a defender of the country, that they've protected the people of the country, and so you want to reward them by making them president pretty much, and Andrew Jackson will use that to his advantage. One last thing to wrap up this Unit 3 review screencast is a Hartford Convention. So the Federalists, remember, I talked about how they predominantly lived in New England. Well, what they're going to do is meet up in New England at this convention. Hartford, I believe, it's either in Rhode Island or Connecticut. They're going to meet and talk about the War of 1812. They're going to talk about why they don't like it. They don't like it because they were trading a lot with Britain, and whenever the trade stops and you're fighting with Britain, you're obviously not going to trade with them, so it's going to hurt them, in their pocketbook financially, and it's going to make them look unpatriotic. And the reason why it's going to make them look unpatriotic is because after the Battle of New Orleans, the United States had won that battle. Andrew Jackson was now a war hero. The country was feeling really, really good about itself. And whenever the country is feeling good about itself because of this war, and you just met to criticize the war, then people are going to look at you and say, well, obviously you don't care anything about the country because we're having a really, a good time. We're having an era of good feelings because of the war, and you thought the war shouldn't even exist. So this led to the end of the Federalist Party. There is going to be no more Federalist presidents at all. In fact, the only Federalist president was John Adams. So it killed the party. It wasn't around after this, and really, any the presidents after this during the era of good feelings, they're all going to be Democratic Republicans. So that is the end of the Unit 3 review screencast. What you need to do now is use the notes you took on your notebook paper, take the Unit 3 quiz. It should be a really easy grade for you, as you've probably found out so far.